Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Wandering Road podcast. I'm your host Chris, and co-hosting with me today is my buddy Aaron because our normal co-host Dean is out having a good time in Japan for the next few weeks. So he's going to be missing in action for today's episode. But for today's show, we're going to be talking about the theology of demons. And before we get started with today's show, if you'd like to share your stories with us or appear as a guest on the show to share your paranormal experiences, please email us at twroadpodcast@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you and we would love to have you as a guest on the show. Again, that email address is twroadpodcast@gmail.com. And with that, we'll get started with today's show. How you doing today, buddy?
Good, man. I feel like every time we hop on here, we always have some creepy weather. Mine is probably the last episode that I was on, but it's cold, it's getting dark, and we're ready to talk theology and demons. How are you tonight?
I'm doing well. My team actually won a football game today.
How about them Steelers?
I know, right? We miraculously scored a touchdown. But weather-wise, it's been a nice day over here. It's been a little chilly. It's been nice to get the fireplace going. So I felt like that set the mood for today's show, you know? A little overcast, got a little fire going. No better way to kick it off.
Right before we hopped on, so as you know, I'm a Cowboy fan. I always find
Unfortunately.
Exactly. I think that's probably the only difference we have athletically, maybe outside of baseball potentially, but that's not even really that far different. But I always look at Bleacher Report before the games come on, and they showed a picture of Dallas's defensive coordinator wearing all black, saying that they're sending that signal to the 49ers. And now I just feel like we're going to lose tonight for some reason.
I guess it's a bad time to be talking about demons then, because your team's going to be playing against a group of them.
I know, man. Well, I'm definitely excited to be on. Glad to be back, and happy to talk about theology, and especially kind of go on to a little bit of the demonic side.
Oh yeah, absolutely. We've been having conversations about this off and on, this particular topic, just discussing like different beliefs on demons throughout like different religions and whatnot, and like what are their similarities, whether they believe them or not, or whether certain groups do exorcisms, just in general, like what do people think about demons, what do established religions think about demons, and what have you got for us today, man?
So I find it really interesting because the last episode that I actually listened to, because I basically listen to every episode, you and Dean kind of went into it at the end where you were talking about people who are non-believers, but they are of a religious denomination. And I always just find that very fascinating because even you and I have had a recent discussion about this pretty much from a biblical, a theological standpoint, however you want to word it. Literally, it's in context about Jesus driving demons away, not using the specific word exorcism, but really just exorcising demons from certain people throughout the Bible. So I always found that very fascinating. And some of the research that I was doing, just kind of looking at different backgrounds when it was pertaining to exorcisms, is really, if you look at it, it's all focused in the name of God or in the name of Jesus. So the exact quotes that are being said are either using the word specifically God or the title or the words in the name of Jesus Christ. So I found that very fascinating. And I know, especially you have some strong opinions on this as well about people who are of the faith or believers, but they say demons don't exist. So where do you kind of fall in that spectrum of people who say, yes, I'm a very firm believer in my faith, but I don't think demons exist?
It kind of baffles me, but I would understand. Let me put it this way. I would understand people that don't want to believe in that, because the entire concept of it is really fucking scary if you think about it. That in your faith, here's an analogy I could think of. Let's toss it to Star Wars, right? There's the Jedi. Let's say there's a group of people that only believe Jedi
Hmm.
exist. The concept of the Sith, which are similar to the Jedi, but they're on the negative side. So it's the same concept of angels and demons. One cannot really exist without the other because it's just based off the balance of nature. But I could understand why someone would not want to acknowledge the other side because it's really scary. It's terrifying. The fact that something could come in and harass you, physically harm you, something you can't see, something that could potentially possess you. So I could see from that perspective of why someone would say, you know what, I don't know whether they exist or not, or even if they do, I'm not going to acknowledge it. I'm just going to stick to what I believe in, focus, and put all of my faith within God or whatever I believe in. That's the justification that I could think of. But to completely leave it out and pretend it doesn't exist, kind of, it's one of those things where it's hard to say because I'm not trying to offend anyone. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? I'm trying to have an objective discussion, trying to keep away what I believe personally. But I believe it's in Mark chapter 5
Hmm.
when Jesus essentially casts out the demon legion. To quickly summarize it, like they basically said this dude is like freaking
Hmm.
insane. And Jesus encounters him. And then Jesus asks the demon its name and it says, "We are legion." And he casts them out. I can't remember what he sends them to, like a herd of pigs or something,
Yeah.
or like a flock of I think it was a herd of pigs,
Yep.
and then they run off a cliff. Certain versions. I know that's the King James version from what I can recall that does that. And the entire concept, like if you don't believe in demons, then you kind of can't really say you believe in that happening. So that really negates a part of your holy scripture. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. And I think the term they actually use from what I saw is called pig Bible, which I tried looking up what that term actually meant because I took it literally as, okay, is there a pig Bible? Like meaning like
Yeah.
what route is this
like
going to take you?
like
No,
pigs?
no, not a Bible for pigs, but that's just the term they use. You actually went into, like I said, specific scripture because that was something I was going to bring up a little bit later on, kind of when you get into exorcisms, because Matthew, Mark, and Luke all specifically mention exorcisms. So it's fascinating in the sense that it actually does have these physical acts being done from a biblical standpoint. But I think it makes a lot of sense what you were saying there. And I think this is where you can really get into a theological discussion with somebody where is it they just don't want to believe that demons or apparitions or spirits exist because technically, and this is where I kind of play it, I'll use a play on words here, so where you play devil's advocate, that in the Bible, there are specific verses in scriptures saying demons don't exist. Almost like that the angels or the prophets, or even too, some of the apostles are saying that they don't want you to believe in demons because what then happens is if you look at the general term of what a demon is from a maybe different religious backgrounds, and I forget exactly which religious background it is, but the whole purpose of demons is really to not attack you and cause you harm, but it's to get in front of you and to want to cause you to sin. So from what I understand in the context that I took from the Bible would actually be they just don't want you to believe demons exist. They know they're there, but they feel that if you start looking at demons being as a physical entity or something that can control your life, then this is going to cause you to want to sin. This will cause you to want to do bad. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. And I think the key word is believe. So it depends on how you use that term, because if I say I believe in God, that means I believe that God exists. I believe, or if I believe in Ares or Zeus, I believe that those figures exist, those deities exist, and I acknowledge their existence. I think when we say believe in demons, it's not, to me, it's not necessarily saying like, oh, I believe in X demon from The Exorcist, right? I'm not acknowledging that they hold power or anything like that. I think that's, you get what I mean? Like the terminology of
Yeah.
believe, we're not expecting. I think people have the misconception that when people say that, oh, I believe that demons exist, it's not in the sense that you're giving them power. It's more so in the sense that you're acknowledging that there is the dark side to it.
So I think that actually is an important word that you brought up there was power because, and if you look at it from a metaphysical standpoint, if you put enough belief or enough thought or enough credence into these entities and these spirits, that could almost be feeding energy into them. So let's say, for example, you and I have talked about this a lot where we get really freaked out, where we want to go do, let's say, a ghost tour down in Gettysburg or something like that. But we always say, man, you know what? We're afraid of attachment. We don't want to bring anything back with us. So let's say you get
Right.
into a scenario like that where that's that type of situation. But let's say that attachment isn't really full, but you have this belief and that fear is really driving this force to maybe attach further or to want to be able to stick into you from that standpoint. Where I saw with exorcisms or with attachment, for example, there's what it's called, I think it's major and minor, to where a minor attachment is where just a demonic entity can really just grab onto a person, but there's not a whole lot to it, versus like a major side of it with an exorcism. That's where you're going full blown, you're calling in the priest, you really got to drive these demons out. So I think the word power actually brings a lot of weight to it, just because I think if you believe hard enough, like you said, and kind of adding those two, that could potentially drive that force or that entity to want to be able to attach to you and then potentially cause more harm from you, if that makes sense.
But yeah, man, I know exactly what you mean. And it reminds me of what me and Dean discussed in a previous episode, that when we talked about Slender Man and manifestations and stuff like that, something called the Tulpa effect. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that term. Are you?
No, not necessarily. I kind of remember something maybe similar in verbiage when I was reading a little bit about exorcisms, but I don't think I know fully too much about it.
Yeah. So to summarize it, basically, it stems from a Buddhist belief that if you believe in something hard enough and you give it its own personality, its own traits, and the fact that it exists, if enough people believe in it, or if people in general believe in it hard enough, it can manifest itself into this existence. So when you were talking just now, it reminded me of Tulpa effect that I talked about before and looked into before, which is completely creepy because I think that's something, like you said, with the whole us wanting to take ghost tours. We weren't familiar with that term, but we were still acting under that premise
Yeah.
with regards to manifestation and attachments and whatnot. So it's really interesting how that syncs up together.
Yeah, no, that is pretty interesting. That actually ties in pretty well. So kind of as we were really just, talking about, what demonology is or how demons really play in the theology, I think what I found fascinating is it actually gets broken down into kind of like four subsets. So when you kind of look at the term theological demons, the first subset of the four, so I'll actually just name the four. So the first one is demonology, eschatology. The third one is folklore, and the fourth one is mythology. So you were kind of mentioning before about like Roman gods, for example. So I found it interesting that they kind of fall that, of course, we know that would fall under the mythological aspect, But I found it really fascinating that actually falls kind of under a demonic sentiment when you look at it from a theological standpoint. And when it comes to demonology, so really just in general, it's the study of demons, but it has religious belief, but it also, there's some entities of myth to it. But it can also refer to studies within theology, religious doctrine, and even occultism, which I think you could really probably go on a whole other deep dive in terms of occultism, in terms of how cults really follow the history of demonic entities and really how areas can go like that. But one of the first things I actually came across, and this is the first thing that popped up into my head, and I found some really fascinating stuff about this, was I always draw first to the Nephilim, because I think I'd mentioned this on previous episodes, but I listen to a lot of Bigfoot podcasts, cryptid. I believe you and Dean recently talked about skinwalkers. Maybe you even talked about Dogman. And I think what's really interesting is everything that really ties back to where these elements come from is the Nephilim. And with the Nephilim, where I really find that fascinating is if you look into anything with Sasquatch or Bigfoot, one of the first things that comes up is like demonic. Are these things demonic? Same thing with like a dog man. They talk about glowing red eyes or just like this evil presence that people feel. And there's a lot of demonism that really comes with it. But there's just so much discussion around the Nephilim that really comes out of, I know I'm going to quote the wrong book of the Bible in itself. It's the first chapter. But
what is it, Book of Enoch?
No, so
or Deuteronomy.
Yeah, so they talk about it in Deuteronomy, but also too, there's a lot of it in regards to the Book of Enoch, which, interesting enough, from the Christian perspective, the Book of Enoch is actually not even recognized anymore. It's only actually recognized in, I think, Ethiopian Orthodox, and there's another like West African Orthodox. But what are your thoughts on the Nephilim? Like, do you kind of see that as maybe being like the entryway or the gateway to demons, or do you have any other knowledge of, like previous demons that you maybe heard about as you kind of did like religious studies or just things that you've read up on?
So to me, the Nephilim fall more into the cryptid category. That's just what I believe personally, in the sense that people in the past have claimed to encounter giants and cyclops and all of these different things, right? All these different, let me put it this way, all the different creatures that you encounter in Greek mythology, like the Hydra, like the Cyclops when Odysseus encounters the Cyclops, and all of these different mythological creatures, or even the Native Americans in their folklore saying that there were races of giants that, they actually fought in combat, or even hell, freaking David and Goliath.
Yeah.
Goliath being like fucking 8 feet tall. Like, who's to say he was a Nephilim? But we know with modern medicine, gigantism is an actual thing. Keyword Andre the Giant. Right. The dude was massive, but he wasn't the son of a fucking fallen angel. He was just a regular dude that was plagued with a medical ailment. But to get back to like the paranormal aspect of it, I think it falls under the cryptic category. If you look at human history and humanity, found like skeletons of these hobbit-sized people, there's skeletons of Neanderthals. There might have been a race of hominids that were kind of above average in size to the average human being at the time. And to understand that, they probably categorized it as some sort of creature that is not of this world. Yeah. It has to be from something other than us. But I can see the argument for the Nephilim being potentially falling into the demonic category. But the only reason I don't really subscribe to that is because the demons in Christianity are technically the fallen angels, right? The ones that rebelled with Lucifer. So to me, if they are the spawn of the fallen angels and the daughters of man, as it says in the text, then they kind of fall into the cryptid category. But yeah, I can see how, like, when when people talk about Dog Man, Goat Man, all these different fucking weird men, right?
I feel like
Skunk
there's
ape.
a man for every single type of cryptid out there.
We haven't run into like dog woman or goat woman yet.
No,
Moth woman.
no, that
It
exactly. It's all man.
yeah, it's all man. Yeah, like me and Dean always say, it we just blame it all on the Mothman. It's always the Mothman's fault.
That's like you
But
said. You always rag on the hag.
rag on the hag, right? Yeah. Yeah, the hag. The hag, maybe that's a demon.
Could be.
Maybe that's a Nephilim. So that one's hard to say as well. But I don't know if I answer your question. I felt like I rambled a little bit, but that's kind of where I fall in with regards to Nephilim. More of like cryptids.
No, it definitely answered that. And the reason why I say so is because that's kind of like the other side of it too. Because something that I always found fascinating is when you read about the Nephilim, there's talk about them really just spawning to be able to reproduce, to be able to create more bad or more demons on Earth. But if you kind of look at that at the same time, it almost takes away some of the credence that man was created by God. So from that standpoint, of course, you have the start with Adam and Eve, and then there's Lilith, which I actually kind of have a side thing about Lilith as well, if we get a chance to go into it a little bit later on. But
Actually, go into it now.
so
I'm curious.
yeah, so with Lilith, so what they said was Lilith was actually the first wife of Adam, and she was expelled from the Garden of Eden because she was trying to really just get him to sin. So, of course, we know the general story is Adam and Eve were expelled from the garden because they ate the forbidden fruit that the devil had placed upon them. But if you look in other texts, which actually falls under Jewish scripture, they talk heavily about Lilith actually being either one, the devil itself, and instead of being a snake in the garden, or number two, Lilith was placed there by the devil to be able to tempt Adam, and God just came in and expelled her and replaced her with Eve. So a lot of the context behind it is Lilith was actually the first demon on earth who was here to be able to cause sin or to be able to cause Adam to rebel against God.
According to the Lilith story, she refused to submit to Adam, which God told her to do. And then it depends on like the variation. She either fled or she was cast out. But it's interesting to me that they claim that she becomes the first demon because she in fact was a human.
Right.
So how does one make that transition? But that could go down another rabbit hole, which I don't think we have time for, even though I would love to discuss that.
Right.
But yeah, Lilith is, yeah, you're right. Because whenever I think about demons, I really don't. Lilith is not the first thing that comes to mind.
No, and I think even recently too, within the past like month or so, you sent me it was a YouTube link about I think it was either about demonology or something with demons, and Lilith actually appeared on that list. It was like 10 uncommon demons or something like that, or I forget what the exact wording was, but she actually appeared on that list. So yeah, I always thought it was very fascinating because if you look at it from that standpoint, you would either have to say that the devil had already turned her and which caused her to become a demon, or where does that really come from? You would have to kind of make the case to say that God actually planted her with evil to be able to go in and then try and tempt Adam. But again, that doesn't really make a lot of sense, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, because then that gets down the realm of why. Like, why? Because according to the Judeo-Christian belief, God is all-knowing, all-forgiving, omnipotent. Like, he knows what's going to happen, what happened, what already happened, etc. So he would have known that Lilith would have done that, thus turning her into a demon. Okay, that's just twisting up my mind with all of these zillion questions.
Well, it's funny you say that. So let's put a pin in that and let's come back to it, because I think that's something that we can bring up at a later point about the why factor in that. But like, as we kind of like go back through, like I said, there were other subcategories as well. There was eschatology, which really all it is eschatology, depending on what religion you look at. It's really just it's almost the prophecy of the end of days. So that could be the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. That could be the second coming of Jesus. Whatever different religion has, that's really what it's geared towards. So I found it interesting that that fall under a demonic category because it more talks about the end of days, unless it's talking about really hell opening up and then all of a sudden you got a Cerberus in front of you coming to bite your head off and all that different stuff. Because I will tell you, interesting thing, and you know this, I come from a Byzantine Catholic background. I'm Eastern Orthodox. In the church, with the second coming of Jesus, when he comes to
Traitor.
with the with not the resurrection, but with the second coming, where it's essentially the end of the world, there is actually a big painting in the church that I went to of Jesus kind of standing on a mound, pulling people out of their graves. But there were, I can't even remember what they are. I'll just say they're I'll just say they're demons underneath that were being like put down by pitchforks, and there was fire and brimstone and everything coming up. So I always found it interesting that from an Eastern Orthodox standpoint, they actually depict these things in the end of times, where it's almost showing that hell was opening up and coming down and really just killing off people, and then there's Jesus just standing there saving the day.
Yeah, that's interesting about that depiction, because in the Roman Catholic belief, they always depict it as Jesus coming down from heaven with the angels, riding into battle with the angels. Like, the angels are armed, they're like on horseback. Well, they have wings. I don't know why they would be on horseback, but let's humor that for a second. But they're all armed, and Jesus has a sword like in his mouth. He's holding the sword in his mouth as his word being the power to, cast down all of these evil entities. Not necessarily like him lopping some demon's head off, like lopping Asmodeus's head off. It's more so like his word is going to be used as the power.
That's wild.
But it's interesting.
It almost reminds me, like you said, Jesus has like a sword or a knife in his mouth. It almost reminds me of like Jack Sparrow going into battle in Pirates of the Caribbean, where he's just about ready to like go pull some crazy thing or whatnot. So here comes Jesus. He's got his blade in his mouth. He's going to do a somersault off the front of his horse, and then boom, boom, everybody starts going down.
Right. Yeah. Freaking Jack Sparrow. And for people that are wrestling fans, when we say the four horsemen, we're not talking about Flair, Arn, Ollie, and Blanchard.
That's right.
So don't worry. They're not the four horsemen of the apocalypse. The good four.
Or depending on what time you grew up or who you're around, Lex Luger, Jeff Jarrett, all the different Mongo McMichael, all the different incarnations. So the third one that I saw was Folklore. So Folklore, we kind of know a little bit about. There was oral traditions, people just kind of passing stories down from generation to generation. What I found fascinating was actually with Folklore, the very first thing that actually came up under Folklore was Christmas. So as we know, kind of there's the whole Christian side of Christmas, and then you have the demonic side of Christmas as well from the other side. But I thought that was interesting. That was the very first thing that popped up. But one thing that...
Come on, don't rag on the Romans like that.
I never rag on the Romans. I have that Italian heritage, so I never really blame my kinfolk there. The one thing I really found interesting here is under the folklore section was the amount of, I guess you can say, space, time, whatever it is, that was dedicated to vampires. So vampires really fell into this category, and interesting enough, the one religion that actually talks about vampires in text is Judaism. And it's in 3 separate books that it actually really talks about vampires in itself. But Jewish texts actually label vampires as they're called estries. That's just one term for really a subset of vampires. So estries can kill pregnant women and babies out of spite or jealousy, and can seduce or sexually assault men, which really falls into the category of a succubus. They can also exist as non-human spirits and transform into non-human animals. So, like, I had a whirlwind going through with this one, because I'm thinking, okay, you got vampires first. We all have a general understanding of what vampires are. Then you throw in, it could be a succubus because it's talking about sexual elements. But then you talk about shape-shifting. So then all of a sudden we're talking skinwalkers here. We're talking jinn. It could be a lot of different things. So like when you
Right.
rattle off all these different things, I don't know, like what do you think in the sense that vampires are kind of listed in Judah and Jewish texts that can literally cover all these different elements?
I never gave any thought to vampires being included in discussion. So this is completely new to me that you brought this up. Because when I think of vampires, you think of kind of like, I don't want to say modern creation, because the whole concept of them had been around for a while. But when you talk about vampires, I think of like Vlad the Impaler. I think of Elizabeth Bathory. You think of Dracula. You think of Nosferatu, which are fairly modern concepts. But I never thought to link it back to our discussion today. But I find that really interesting.
So the interesting thing too, so there's actually a first presence of a vampire in biblical texts. The name is Alukah. Alukah is the first Jewish vampire to appear in the Bible. It's in the Book of Solomon. And in the Proverbs of Solomon, Alukah is referred to as a female demon, possibly related to Lilith. So bringing Lilith back into it. Or it's even possible that Alukah is another name for Lilith. So that's interesting as well, because as we know, a lot of the Christian and a lot of Christian stories are inherited from Judeo texts in the sense that they were tying these two together. And the fact that Lilith could have been a vampire all along, which again, I'm going to kind of err on the side of that's not being true, just because this would technically be the first woman in existence. But what I'm finding interesting here is, like you said, Vlad the Impaler, Dracula, whoever it may be, we always think of vampires as being male.
Right.
Jewish text is actually alluding to vampires originally being female. And I found it very interesting too, and I think this goes back to what we were talking about earlier when it comes to, let's say, belief or power, that a lot of this is really curated out of jealousy. So what they're doing is they are jealous of somebody, so they're going and attacking them, and that's where they're going and being able to live off of blood. And that's how they really keep their existence.
I wanted to ask you real quick, that just quickly came to mind. According to what you were just talking about with the references that we had, was that the first vampire was female. The first disobedient person was female. Lilith or Eve. I know this is kind of branching off away to a little side discussion. I promise I'll reel it back in. But you ever notice that all these texts always tend to the first bad person is always a woman? You ever notice that?
It seems to be the trend. I mean, I don't know how many followers you have that you might have just lost there that are on the female side. But outside of that, I mean, that is pretty fascinating.
Oh no! I'm coming in defense of them. I noticed a trend in history. For example, the a podcast that I did with Dean where we talked about Elizabeth Bathory a little bit, who was dubbed the Blood Countess. She inherited a shit ton of money because her husband was super rich. And then there were people that owed her money. And what way to get rid of her and not pay anything back and steal all of her shit is to say that she's a vampire and have other people corroborate all of these stories saying how she bathed in blood, she consumed the blood of kids and little girls to demonize her and take all of her shit. I just noticed that
what
that
correlation.
Yeah, that common trend.
Right.
It's a common trend.
But I think
it's just something I noticed.
I think it's good in that sense, though, because it's interesting now. Because again, when you look at figures throughout history, it's always from the male perspective. You know, I really don't think you really get to later times until you start thinking of people like Joan of Arc, for example. She's always one of the first ones that pops in my mind, but even too Cleopatra. But when you go back into these origin stories, really the most prominent ones are the females, not necessarily the males.
Right. Yeah. Joan of Arc, for example, she freaking 15-year-old girl whooped the English's ass multiple times over. And when they finally caught her, they called her a witch.
Yep.
She's in deal with demons and the devil. So we got to burn her.
Got to burn her at the stake.
So you got to burn her at the stake. So it's always a constant trend. But I digress from that. Let's continue about
Well,
demons.
and so another thing about Alukah as well. So the Sefer Hasidim, I'm probably butchering this, but one of the Jewish texts refers to Alukah actually as a living human being that can shapeshift into a wolf, can also fly, and it must feed on blood to survive. So again, you think of vampires, depending on how you look at it, whether it be from a historical standpoint, from a, let's say, even a movie standpoint, vampires can be known to fly. But I thought the two interesting things that really stuck out there was, again, number one was shape shifting. It didn't really go into direct specifics about what it could shapeshift into other than a wolf, but that could rightly allude to the very first Dogman, because Dogman, it could be the head of a dog. A lot of people say the head of a wolf, but also too, it can stand on two legs. It can walk fully upright, and it's known from stories that you can listen to is it is actually known to shift into different shapes as well. So whether that be the origin of a skinwalker, whether it be the origin of a dogman, a shapeshifter, whatever you want to call it, I found it very interesting. Again, that is literally just found in Jewish text, something that I never really knew about before.
Yeah, that was a first for me, what you just brought up with Alukah. So I'm glad you brought that up, that they turn into a wolf and they can shapeshift and they need to survive on blood. It just, I just recall back to the episode with the Wendigo and the Skinwalker, with the shapeshifting and the need for blood and all of this bad stuff that they do. But I wanted to, if you don't mind, segue into mythology, because I'm a big mythology guy
Absolutely.
with Greco-Roman mythology. And one thing I wanted to ask you is that, specifically with the Greco-Roman pantheon,
Hmm.
in Greek, I think the word for, I guess, I don't want to say demon, but they use the word daemon for like spirits and
Hmm.
whatnot. What are your thoughts? Here's an idea that I have, that I'm pretty sure other people have discussed as well, is that the Greek pantheon and all of these gods essentially being incorporated into Christianity, the Christian faith, morphing them
Hmm.
into the quote unquote demons to drive people away from them.
Yeah, that's something I came across as well, and I mean it's really hard because you're big, I should say, with mythology, or it's something you like to follow, but also too, like it's something that I followed as well. So when you look at these different figures throughout history, and the funny thing is what's interesting about it is all these, let's say, gods or these supernatural figures throughout Greek, Roman, Norse mythology, for example, being turned into these, I don't even know really how to word it. I guess you could say non existential figures, if that makes sense. And the reason why I say non existential figures is I kind of almost allude them to being non important. Like it's almost like the Bible takes these different figures and they just try to turn them into an element that we can keep, but the name is different, the location is different. Really, if you kind of look through the annals of history in terms of what they do it on the Christian, or the, you can say Catholic and Christian, it's the same thing. But from that standpoint, really all they turned them into was a president of hell or a gatekeeper of hell, or it's this person or this creature who has 666 legions with 66 different people who follow them. And I thought that was another fascinating thing that really came up too, was the fact that there's literally hundreds of demons that are brought over from these different mythological creatures, and the origin of it, or not the origin, but they're all placed into hell, and they all own their own little subsection of hell with all their different legions. So I hope I answered your question there. From that standpoint, I guess I get it from a historical standpoint in terms of why they would want to do this, but outside of that, I don't know really what the merit is behind it, of just kind of overlooking these different figures, other than just trying to say there's one God, there's no other gods. and we need to wipe this slate off so that way these don't exist because this isn't the word, the truth, and the life, to kind of put it into context in one God, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it definitely does. I would understand why they would, take the pantheon and morph it into something purely evil that's misleading. Because if you look at the pantheon, it's not necessarily, and I'm focusing on the Greco-Roman pantheon because that's what I'm most familiar
Mm-hmm.
with. I can't really speak for Norse mythology or any other pantheon of gods like Hinduism because I'd be talking out of my
Mm-hmm.
ass. But with the Greco-Roman pantheon, it's one of those things where they're not really good or bad. They essentially have personalities like people do. And I think that's one of the main attractors to those gods at the time, personally, for me. Because they share so many similarities with the average person aside from being a deity.
No, I understand that. And like some ones that really came up into my mind is thinking of like why they would want to, I guess, lessen these figures. So, like Juno, for example, Juno, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but Juno is the god of war, correct?
Uh Juno is not the god of war. That would be Ares or
Gotcha.
Mars.
Okay, never mind. I was looking at the wrong one. But even from that standpoint, with really going into being, let's say, like a god of war, for example, I don't think you always necessarily look at it from being really a negative perspective. But when you look at it from like the church, for example, and I'd really be interested to sit down and kind of figure out when these mythical figures really transitioned from a, let's just keep it, mythological standpoint to more of a biblical standpoint to where you could really pinpoint these down. And maybe you know some of that in terms of when some of that transition started happening. Like, are you aware of when some of this really starts coming into text, or when you kind of see of a transition of them trying to get away from it?
I can't definitively say, but I could take a good guess when Constantine converted to Christianity before he whooped the shit out of Maxentius at the Melvian Bridge.
So probably around the time of the Council of Nicaea.
Yeah, probably around that time. And the Council of Nicaea, I kind of have some gripes with them because they essentially, under the supervision of Constantine, if I'm correct in that assessment, they kind of decided to pick and choose what goes into the Bible and what should be quote unquote
Mm-hmm.
banned. So it'd be interesting to see what those quote unquote banned texts say about like other spirits and demons and whatnot.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. So that kind of gives us a little bit of a segue onto the exorcism side that we can kind of stay on topic as well. Is so the Book of Mary Magdalene, Jesus actually exorcises 7 demons from Mary Magdalene, and this is in, this may be right or wrong, but I believe this is actually in the Book of Mary Magdalene, and that's one of the reasons why the Council of Nicaea actually left out the Book of Mary Magdalene, because they didn't want Mary being seen at such a negative light outside of her being a quote unquote prostitute. But outside of that, they don't want it being in religious text saying that Jesus actually had to exorcise 7 demons from Mary Magdalene herself.
Have you read that
I
book?
have not. No, I just knew this because I heard about this growing up. Like I said, I think this is where a difference in religion really comes along. But a little bit earlier on, not through Sunday school per se, but I just remember in church in itself hearing this story about, and the word exorcism wasn't necessarily used. It was more labeled as the removal or extraction of demons. And for some reason, that always kind of stuck with me. And as I was going through and just kind of reading about this recently, that story popped back in to the readings that I actually saw. And when that came about, when I was looking at the Book of Enoch, and the reason why that was interesting from that perspective is I read about it because the Book of Enoch obviously was not added in to the Bible in itself. And then just like the Book of Mary Magdalene, they just don't want, even though Mark, Matthew, and Luke specifically talk about exorcism, they don't want a specific figure being identified. But with Mary, they just don't want her being seen as having to really have demons exorcised from her. So I always thought that was very interesting. But from the standpoint of really exorcisms, I found a lot of different interesting things about this. So there's different backgrounds and there's different religions that actually specifically talk about exorcism per se. So in Christianity, Catholicism, Eastern Orthodox, Lutheran churches, and even the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they all recognize exorcism, and they actually have specific, I guess you could say, protocol for it. But then also too, and I wasn't even aware of this, and I'm going to make a little bit of a joke at the end of this one, but Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, and Taoism all recognize exorcism. So the reason why I said I was going to make a joke is because, and I think Dean's in Japan, correct?
Yeah, he's in Japan.
I was going to say Dean's going to come back and we're going to have to perform a Taoism exorcism on him because he had a spirit attached to him.
Oh, man. That'd be rough.
But what I found interesting, just kind of as we were looking at exorcisms, because we were talking about demons and really what it is just the different practices that go into it. So with just general Christianity, there's two kind of things that I really found interesting here. Is number one, it just has to be a member of the church, or it's somebody who is blessed or has special skills or powers, which I was kind of interesting that the word powers was used, who can really be able to perform exorcisms. But here's the interesting thing that I really found out. I don't know if I shared this with you earlier or not, but exorcisms actually were on the decline in the United States by the 18th century, and they rarely occurred, or maybe they were rarely talked about or written about until the latter half of the 20th century, when the public saw a sharp rise due to the media attention around The Exorcist, the movie. So apparently that's when stories really started coming back. And I don't know if you want to call it mass hysteria or whatever started happening, but I just thought it was interesting that literally from the 1700s all the way up until about the mid 1900s, there was a quote unquote decline in exorcisms until people either started talking about them again or the movie The Exorcist came out.
I think the reason for that is because it became part of like the popular culture at the time because of the Exorcist book and, like you said, the Exorcist movie. But the Vatican has always had exorcists. Like that has always existed. Like the Vatican has always had an exorcist. But I think when you talk about, let's say, the 1700s, the 1800s, and whatnot, it would be one of those things where if someone is possessed, I'm just speculating at this point. Let's talk about from the colony's perspective.
They were a witch?
Because, yeah.
Yeah.
You're breaking away. Like the whole point of the pilgrims and all that stuff was for them, for their religious freedom, right? So I don't think they would have. I mean, feel free to, whoever's listening to this, email us, correct us if we're wrong. I'm always open to learning new things because by trade I am a historian, even though I don't do that professionally. But I would think that they would be disassociated from the Catholic Church and from the Church of England.
Yeah.
In which they wouldn't have the same type of belief in demonic possession. Because what you saw with the Salem witch trials, because it's already known that the girls were faking it, right? Let's say one of the girls were really possessed and they were doing all of this outlandish shit. They would just call them a witch, and you're corroborating with Satan, and they'll just hang you or they'll burn you. So I think it's a very simplistic type of thing. And even with the Spanish Inquisition, I would assume someone that was possessed would have been fucked up by them.
You would think so.
They wouldn't have exercised them.
Right.
The only exercise you're going to be getting is that breaking wheel, dude. You're not going to, they're going to put your ass on the rack and stretch you out until you stop speaking in tongues or you die. Like that's, to me, that's what would happen.
And
But I don't
I
think
really think you're onto something there too, and that makes a lot of sense because if you think about it from, like you said, starting with the Salem witch trials, or even to earlier on when the what was the book, the not the Magnum Maleficaris, you know what I'm talking about. I have the second part right. I don't have the first word down.
Malleus
Malleus
Maleficarum, the
Maleficarum.
hammer of
Yes,
witches.
exactly. So from that standpoint, if you look at it, they're not exercising anything. They're being put to the stake. They're being burned. They're being drowned. They're just being mass killed. You could take that really on to saying like, okay, these aren't witches. We got full on vampires here because we just got to get rid of. We got to burn them. We got to kill them. We got to put them at the stake. We got to do whatever we can do. So that actually makes a lot of sense. And the reason why there could be a downplay there is because with the whole witch hysteria, they could just be seen, hey, we have to get rid of them. We're not going to exercise this. And also, too, and I think this plays more in the present day, and this is kind of a note I put down for a little bit later but we can kind of talk about it right now. But whenever you're looking at really a possessed person, a lot of emphasis right now, and even too over the last, I'd say probably 50 plus years, is really placed on mental illness. Because there were certain religions where, and I think it's the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, before you can even be eligible for an exorcism, you actually have to be checked out by a physician to make sure you're not crazy before they can even call somebody in to come and do this. So I thought that was very fascinating as well. And that's kind of a hot topic that really comes in. But you were talking about the Vatican and the church. They literally have had exorcists, really just forever. And they follow what is called the Ritual Romanum, which is really the guide for performing exorcisms. And also, too,
What was the base word for that? The last word? What was that?
Romanum.
What was that, people?
Romanum.
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 Rome lives
That's
forever.
Right. SPQR, my friend.
Yes, sir. Like that, I'm going to sidetrack for a little bit. Like that trend that they had going on social media where women were asking guys, like their husbands and stuff, how many times a day you think about the Roman Empire. And my wife asked me that question while I was wearing my Roma jersey with the SPQR.
24/7, lady.
24/7. Julius Caesar did nothing wrong. But that is incorrect.
Correct.
He enslaved millions and massacred the Gauls.
Right.
But what's interesting, how you brought up you have to go talk to a medical professional. The Catholics do that too. I was watching a podcast with the exorcist Father Vincent Lampert. I forget which podcast he was on. Oh geez, I saw it on YouTube. I think it was like PBD or something like that, because I was like specifically looking up podcasts with people that like priests that have done exorcists.
Sure, they're not talking about that
and
on PBS.
What he's I doubt it. That would be scary. Like, what the fuck
next
happened?
After Sesame Street.
Exorcisms. The historical ancient Catholic rite.
And how Big Bird's involved.
Big Bird was like the first person to do an exorcist. But yeah, Father Vincent Lampert, he said that what the church does now is that they'll refer you to a medical professional. Like the church has like psychiatrists and doctors and stuff on hand that they will refer people to. And I don't remember if it was him or if it was another father that was talking about exorcism, but they basically said that the people that come to them asking for an exorcism, 9 times out of 10, they have a physical ailment. They have some sort of mental disability. And they said that the cases in which they have to perform the rite of exorcism, which they have to get permission, they have to be ordained by the church to do it. You can't just go and just be like, hey, Father, I need an exorcism. You need to provide proof to the diocese, and the bishop has to essentially allow that to happen. In really bad cases, they go all the way to the Vatican and they'll like talk to people. Like, I don't know if you saw the Pope's Exorcist movie. It's based on the Vatican exorcist, Father Gabriele Amorth. Like, he was the prime exorcist for for the Catholic
Mhm.
Church. Like if it gets really bad, like if like someone like Father Amorth was getting involved, then it's really bad. But they said that the people that are the ones that say, "Oh, Father, like if the families get involved and bring them to the priest, they'll be the ones to say, no, I think it's a medical thing. I need to go." And 9 times out of 10, the people that do say that and they get checked out medically and it's like there's nothing wrong with them medically and they're still having all of these issues, those are the people that tend to have exorcisms.
So you mentioned
From what
physical ailments. I don't know if you were actually meaning to say mental ailments, but is there situations that you've seen or like heard of where physical ailments actually cause into play as well for somebody not to get one? Because it could be, so like let's say for example it could be something like leprosy, or they could just like be broken out with boils. Like is that something you were referring to as well, where a physical ailment could actually expel somebody from getting one?
I don't think I meant to say physical ailment, but I meant to say like some physical like type of bodily harm or something like
Okay.
that, where it's like they have like actual like wounds on their body or something like that. They'll be checked out by the doctor to see if they actually did it to
Right.
themselves or not.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was referring to. But most of the time, it's mental.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense because I came across a lot of circumstances where that was kind of the first thing that was looked at. Like I said, with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that was really the first thing that actually popped up. And even to the different Lutheran churches, like really the only thing that came across with Lutheran churches is must consult a physician to rule out any illness. Which, I mean, it also makes a lot of sense because I think statistically, I would actually like to see some numbers for if that's actually kept, how many people mentally thought that they were being possessed versus if they just had some kind of physical ailment. Like I would really like to see those numbers.
Like schizophrenia and like multiple
Hmm.
person disorder, that type of stuff. Yeah, that would be interesting to see because you would think that the amount of people being possessed is not
Hmm.
high.
And
That's something that's really should be uncommon.
right,
I
exactly.
would hope.
The one commonality I came across is just really how they're performed. So there's different variations of how they can be performed. Like I said, you can either be checked out by a medical physician first to rule it out. There is certain things that you can do. Like, for example, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, there's one of two methods. You're either anointed with oil on your forehead that can actually expel something from you, or the other commonality that comes in across everything with Christianity is the fact that it's all of, hey, in the name of Jesus Christ, and then certain verbiage is used. So there's a lot of commonalities there. I think the one that really stuck out for me was, again, being Byzantine Catholic, was just with the Eastern Orthodox and how they do it. And it's not even really how they do it, it's kind of how it's traced. But like I said, they actually do trace it through biblical accounts of Jesus expelling demons. So that's how it was really tracked. And like I said, the books of Mark, Matthew, and Luke all kind of talk about these. And that's really where that lineage comes from in terms of how they do it. They have to invoke the name of Jesus to be able to do it. And then also, too, like you had mentioned with the Catholic Church, there are physicians who are trained to discern mental illness from possession. So being able to really tell the difference between the two and say, okay, you actually, it's weird to be able to say it this way, but you qualify for an exorcism. It's almost
Right,
like saying,
right.
hey,
We recommend an
exactly,
exorcism.
we don't think it's this. We recommend you go get an exorcism. I just think it's some really odd verbiage there. Were there any kind of interesting tidbits or anything that you wanted to talk about whenever it came to exorcisms?
One thing with exorcisms is that it always intrigues me that these things can go like horribly wrong to the point where like you
Mm-hmm.
die. And I've always found that fascinating. And let's say for the example, let's humor me for a second, humor this hypothetical. There's someone that's possessed and they got cleared by a psychiatrist. Like all the medical professionals were involved. They took them to the hospital. They're like, we don't know what the fuck is wrong with them. They don't have schizophrenia. They don't exhibit this. They don't exhibit that. But I think we need to get a priest in here because this motherfucker's floating off the
Right.
bed. And let's say they perform the rites of exorcism, and then the person dies during that performing that exorcism, like when they do that rite. I always wonder why that would be the case. Like, is it because the priest wasn't strong enough, or they didn't believe enough? All these factors always come into my head because you always get the stories of, successful exorcisms. You rarely see the cases of ones that were not successful. Aside from that, if you ever watched the Exorcism of Emily
Hmm.
Rose, that
Yep.
movie, it's based off of that girl in Germany that they exorcised her like 20 times or some shit like that. But she was actually had a medical
Hmm.
issue. But let's say in that case that type of person didn't have a medical issue and then they die because of the exorcism. That's the what always plays in my mind. Like, does it become a faith thing? Does it become a thing where like the demon decided, you want fuck this, like I'm not going to give you the satisfaction and just kill them? Like, have you ever thought about that before?
Yeah, so it's funny you bring that up because that is exactly what I was thinking and what I was going to ask you. Because that's the thing that popped up into my head is like, what happens when it goes wrong? And if so, why does it happen? Is it because there was just so much strain on the body that whenever this process is finished, that literally the body just completely shuts down? Like, is it like, so like you could say like literally it could be this person has a heart attack and there was just so much strain on the heart that by the time it's over, the heart just can't take anymore. So I mean, I guess that could be one explanation, or it could be two. I guess if you really look at it from a spiritual standpoint, the fact that it are these entities literally taking your soul, like that could be a common question as well, is because like and I think that goes into really deeper meaning in the fact that what type of life did this person lead. So for example, like I would say, if you're a God fearing person, if you do right, you don't do bad throughout your life. I think it would be safe to say, okay, this demonic entity is not going to take my soul and drag it to hell. However, though, was this person dealing drugs to kids? Was this person beating their dog? Were they stabbing people? Where did they commit crimes and they just never repented, or they just never had any type of goodness in their heart? That literally this is one of those factors where and I think this is kind of like we said, everything that God does is all predetermined. But is it just predetermined that, hey, this person's just going to be dragged to hell, and by the time we have a person of God trying to save you, you're just going to go to hell? Yeah,
Right,
I mean, I guess
right.
you could look at it from a lot of different factors. It could be a physical standpoint, it could be a spiritual standpoint, but that's a really good question. And I was thinking the same exact thing. I mean, what are your thoughts there? Do you think any of those really have any weight to it, that it could just be the body physically shutting down? Or do you think there's any spiritual component that literally the soul is just not taken to heaven or left into a body?
I think a medical aspect might come into play, that it just gets so weakened from the stress of the entire situation, because stress can kill people. It can like induce heart attacks, yada yada yada. So that's definitely a component of it. But one thing that you brought up, which I kind of personally have a gripe with, not specifically with you, but the whole concept of
Hmm.
predetermination. Because if this is predetermined to happen, everything else between that time and the beginning kind of really doesn't fucking
Hmm.
matter. And it's hard to grasp my mind around that. Like, why would someone, let's say it's like a little kid, why would someone like a little kid be predetermined to go through a possession,
Hmm.
even if they didn't do anything wrong? Let's say hypothetically they're just out on the pitch playing footy, and then all of a sudden they get possessed by
Hmm.
something. I don't understand the justification of like this being predetermined, that they would have to suffer in that manner. It's a little frustrating, but that's the theological side of it, that like it's really hard to talk about because we just don't know. It's all speculation. We really won't know until, we pass on and we meet whatever you believe in. You know what I
This
mean?
reminds me a lot of when I was a child, and I was always that kid in Sunday school who asked why. And it wasn't really because I was looking for a specific answer, it was because I was looking to understand.
Oh, you were a little shit.
Well, that too. I mean, I'm not gonna lie. Some of it was really just to kind of egg on my Sunday school teachers, but also at the same time, it's I'll give you an example. A lot of my questions is like when I was a child, where did God come from? You know, if we all come from Him, where did He come from? Like, there's got to be somebody before Him, and the answer was always just, well, He's just always been there. And I'm like, well, what do you mean He's always just been there? Like, for me, that wasn't a logical answer. So it really never made sense to me. And again, I understand the answer now as an adult because it's all about your faith. It's all about belief. You just know that He's there. But one of the things that I have always kind of, I guess, struggled with and thought about was, and you kind of hit it on there, you know, a kid's out on the pitch, he's playing footy, just gets possessed, or you know, for example, we read stories all the time now of younger and younger people who like play high school football, for example, and they just collapse on the field, and then like the next day they die. Is almost what's the reasoning behind that? And the reason why I ask this is because it's not like it happened to somebody like Mussolini or I don't know why I specifically said Mussolini, but a really historical figure that really put prominence in time.
Like really shitty people.
Yeah,
Let's put it
yeah,
that
we'll
way.
say really
Like,
shitty people. Why
right.
is this kid who maybe hasn't put that big of an impact on the world or hasn't done anything really significant to make a big difference? Why is he the one that this is being predetermined for? And I think that's really the hardest thing to be able to understand. But then again, I think more as an adult, I'm more of a half glass full kind of person. I think it kind of comes into a smaller context of, okay, it's not so much of what am I doing for the world? What impact have I made on the people around me? So that could be my family members, that could be my friends, that could be my teachers. There could have been somebody's life that that person had touched. So, I mean, there's a lot of back and forth with this. And you can literally have a psychological, theological, whatever type of discussion you want to have with it. But at the end of the day, it's always going to be one of those answers that we're never going to understand or get until after we are not on this earth.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. But I want to circle back to what we were talking about in the beginning with regards to demons and, you know, people's like believing in demons and the whole religious aspect of it. I know we're a little pressed for time, so I think this we'll wrap up with this. We tried to be objective earlier, didn't want to piss anyone off, but we live in a free country. So like what are your personal thoughts on the entire concept of demons and people that say that, you know, I believe in God, but, you know, to me, demons don't exist at all. Like, what is your perspective?
I think really for me, it's one of two things. It's either they just don't want to think about it because they just don't want to believe these things exist. Or for me, and this is kind of the road that I go down, I honestly don't think they're true believers. And I'm not saying that they're not a true believer in God, but I think they just don't understand their own religious history. And it really reminds me of in Angels and Demons, the quote that Tom Hanks made whenever they were talking about the Vatican and religious history. And literally, the quote he made to the head of the Swiss Guard was, geez, you guys don't even know your own history. That's where I kind of sit on the fence a little bit with this, is because I just think people don't understand their own history. I really think that either one, they're not taught this, or number two, they are taught and they just want to overlook it because it is not good. So, from that standpoint, I'm not going to say that they're not true believers, but I also sit on the side where I would say is they're a believer, but I don't think they could really have full faith in God and Jesus Christ until they understand that these things exist. They're around for a reason. But at the end of the day, we have somebody here to protect us from that. And that is where my faith is really going to sit and lie. What are your thoughts on it? Because I don't think we've actually gone into discussion before. I know you have some pretty, I don't know if I want to use the word strong thoughts, but I know you have some pretty good thoughts about this. where do you really sit in regards to people who say they're a believer, but they don't necessarily believe demons exist or there just are no such things?
I fall on the side of either they were taught that or they're afraid to go deep into the theology of the discussion. Because if, and for folks listening, we're talking specifically from a Catholic or Christian perspective, because that's what we know. We're sticking to what we know based off of what we were brought up on. But for me specifically, I think one, it's a fear factor, the fear of the unknown, the fear of something being powerful. But I don't think it's something to be really afraid of, because if you are strong in your faith, like, you automatically accept the fact that, God created the bastards. They rebelled, so he has supreme power over them. So there's nothing to be afraid of in that sense. But the whole entire concept of them existing, yeah, it's a creepy concept based off of how they're portrayed in medieval tapestries and Renaissance art and all of these different things. I think that has an influence on it. I stopped myself from going on a rant on one of my previous podcasts when I said there are groups of people out there that don't fucking believe in demons. And it really, really baffles my mind, because in the Bible, Jesus casts out legion. If you don't acknowledge that, you're kind of not acknowledging, like, the ability for him to do that. And I apologize if I piss anyone off with that, but too fucking bad, because it's literally in the text. Go look up the book of Mark. Read the book of Mark. It is in there. Pull it up on YouTube. Look up Jesus casting out legion. So that's why it's like, I really don't understand why they take that stance, but I could understand the fear factor of it. I can understand when you're brought up, your upbringing plays a big part of it. Because, like I said, when I was brought up in the Catholic faith, they don't hold any punches. If you go sit in a like, you go to church every Sunday and you sit in a Catholic sermon, and I don't know if it was the same for you for the Byzantine Catholic sermon, they literally talk about all of this stuff. They talk about hellfire, they talk about brimstone, they talk about possessions, they talk about the devil. They don't leave anything out. They don't sugarcoat it, because it's important to know your theology. Like they say, it's important to know your history. It's important to know the historical aspect of your theology. So when you do encounter people that may not be as educated as you or have a very strong theological background that are challenging you, you should be able to challenge them back. And that's why I think it's important to do that. Not to say that, okay, you have to acknowledge demons or anything like that, because they exist whether you like them or not. It's more so for educational purposes and to have a strong theological background to understand why certain things are the way they are within your faith.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. And honestly, I don't see how that could really piss anybody off. And if it does piss anybody off, I'll literally just tell you, just grow a set and open your mind. Because again, we're all human beings. We all have different thoughts. We all have different beliefs, whatever it may is. And just because we say something that you don't agree with doesn't mean you have to raise a fuss about it. But the way that I really kind of look at it as a whole as well is these things, these demons, these entities, whatever you want to call them, they were put here for a reason. They were put here to test our faith. Throughout the annals of time, your faith is not really there if you are swayed in the other direction by something as simple as this. Jesus lasted in the desert, being tempted by the devil X amount of times without even batting an eye, and he just quoted scripture. If you are somebody of full belief, if you are somebody of full faith, and you know that there is one God, there is the God Almighty, or whatever else you might believe in, then these tempts, these sins, these outside distractions that are going to turn you into the negative and take you onto the dark side, none of that's going to matter, because you're just going to turn your cheek, look the other direction, and you're going to have a clear path right to God.
And I'll preface this before we end today, folks. This was a theological discussion that him and I have very frequently. We're not priests, we're not these higher than thou religious people. We just view things from a very analytical perspective, and we brought that together for today's show. So I just want to preface that before we end today.
Okay, and also one last thing as we depart, man. Rag on the hag.
Rag on the hag. Rag on that damn hag.
That's right.
Don't give her a moment's rest.
Amen.
Thanks for tuning into today's episode of The Wandering Road. You can find us on Apple, Google, Spotify, and most podcast platforms. Be sure to subscribe and share. Also, don't forget to give a follow on Instagram at twroadpodcast and follow my TikTok at twrpodcast. Take care, and I'll catch you on the next one.